Calvin, before you start counting money, make sure you know who owns it.
She didn't pack a bag. She didn't change the locks. She didn't post anything online, call her girlfriends crying, or confront him in the driveway. When Margaret Ellison discovered that her husband had brought another woman to his mother's dinner table, introduced her, smiled beside her, let his family ask about her preferences for furniture, Margaret did one thing. She observed. She filed it away, quietly, the way a woman does when she has already decided that the truth will speak louder than anything she could say in that moment. Her mother-in-law, Dorothy, called her emotionless, said she was too focused on business to be a real wife. Her husband, Calvin, said the marriage had been over for years. The woman they brought to that table, a younger woman named Simone, had already started imagining which room she would redecorate first. None of them stopped to ask one question. One simple question that would have saved them all from what was coming. Whose name is on everything? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why that question, the one nobody thought to ask, became the most expensive mistake this family ever made. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened, you have to understand who Margaret Ellison actually was. Not who Calvin's family decided she was. Not the cold, distracted wife they described at church socials and family barbecues. The real woman. Margaret grew up watching her father build things. Not with his hands, with his mind. Her father, Robert Ellison, spent 30 years quietly acquiring commercial properties, small business holdings, and investment accounts across 3 states. He was not flashy. He was not loud. He believed that real wealth whispers. And he raised his daughter the same way. By the time Margaret finished her MBA, she already understood something most people spend a lifetime learning. That the person who controls the documents controls the outcome. Always. She met Calvin Hargrove at a mutual friends gathering when she was 31. He was charming, warm, the kind of man who filled a room with energy. He made her laugh. He made her feel less serious than she usually allowed herself to be. They married within 2 years. What Calvin never fully understood, what he never thought to ask about, actually, was the foundation beneath the life they were building together. He assumed it was shared. He assumed that the house, the holdings, the investments, all of it, belonged to both of them equally, the way married people assume things belong to both of them. Assumptions, as it turns out, are not legal documents. And legal documents were Margaret Ellison's specialty. The dinner was Dorothy Hargrove's idea. Calvin's mother had always been a woman who operated on certainty. She decided things, and then she moved the world around her decisions like furniture. She had decided, several months earlier, that her son's marriage was finished and that a woman named Simone Vance would be a far better fit. Simone was younger, warmer in the way Dorothy approved of, more present at family events, quicker to compliment the food, easier to manage. Dorothy liked easy to manage. So she arranged the dinner. It was framed as a family gathering. Extended relatives. A Sunday meal. Nothing unusual on the surface. Margaret arrived composed, dressed simply, carrying nothing but her quiet attention. She noticed Simone the moment she walked in. She noticed how Calvin avoided her eyes. She noticed how Dorothy smiled, just slightly too wide. She sat down. She said very little. And Dorothy, interpreting silence as surrender, grew bolder. Midway through the meal, Dorothy set down her fork and looked directly at Margaret. "I'll say what everyone here is thinking," she announced. The table went still. "You have treated this marriage like a business arrangement. A man needs warmth. A man needs a partner who is present. You have been more committed to your contracts than to your husband." A few relatives nodded cautiously. Others studied their plates. Margaret considered this for a long moment. Then she said one word. "Interesting." Dorothy frowned. "Interesting? That's your response." "It's an interesting complaint," Margaret said. "You believe the problem in our marriage is that I work, isn't it?" "No." Calvin became very focused on the food in front of him. Because he knew. He knew exactly what the real problem was. And he desperately hoped Margaret would not say it out loud. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and returned to her meal. The table waited for an explosion that never came. Dorothy interpreted Margaret's calm as weakness. That was her second mistake. Her first had been arranging the dinner. Later that evening, as guests filtered out and the house grew quiet, Calvin followed Margaret into the study. She was reading, as though the evening had been perfectly ordinary. "You're not going to say anything?" he asked. She looked up. "About what?" "You know exactly what. The dinner. What would you like me to say?" He stared at her. He wanted anger. He wanted a fight. Something emotional, something that would make him feel more justified in the choices he was already making. Instead, he got stillness. "Aren't you upset?" he finally said. She closed her book. "I'm disappointed," she said. "And I'm embarrassed, for everyone involved." Then she walked upstairs. Calvin stood alone in the study for a long time. Something had started to feel wrong. He couldn't name it yet, but it was there, quiet and persistent, like a draft from a door left open somewhere in the house. Dorothy did not read the room. In the weeks that followed, she grew louder, not quieter. She began openly discussing Simone at family gatherings, at church, at birthday parties. She described Margaret as cold and unfeeling. She described Simone as Calvin's future, said it plainly, confidently, to anyone who would listen. And Simone, who genuinely believed the picture being painted for her, began planning accordingly. She was not a villain in this story. She was simply a woman who had been handed a version of reality and had not yet received a reason to question it. One Sunday, Dorothy hosted lunch at her home. Simone attended. Calvin attended. Several cousins filled the dining room. Conversation turned to the future, the way it always does when people believe they already know what the future holds. Dorothy smiled warmly at Simone. "When Calvin settles everything, you two will probably move into the house. The Ellison house is beautiful." Simone smiled. "It really is." One cousin looked up slowly. "Which house?" "The Ellison estate," Dorothy said. The cousin set down his glass. Unlike Dorothy, he happened to know a detail or two. Not everything, but enough. "Isn't that property in Margaret's name?" The room went quiet. Dorothy waved the concern away. "That doesn't matter. Marriage changes things." The cousin looked at Calvin. Calvin looked away. That look told the cousin everything he needed to know. Across town, Margaret's days continued without interruption. Business reviews, property evaluations, board meetings. The drama at home barely touched her schedule. One Tuesday morning, she sat across from her attorney, a man named Gerald Patton, who had represented her father for 20 years before representing her. Gerald adjusted his glasses. "I've been hearing things," he said. "I'm sure you have," Margaret replied. "Are they accurate?" "Most of them." He leaned back. "Are you planning to do anything?" "Not yet." Gerald nodded. He had known Margaret long enough to understand what that meant. Not passivity. Timing. Passive people avoid action. Patient people choose their moment. Margaret always chose her moment. Then Gerald opened a folder. "There is one thing you should be aware of. Someone has begun making inquiries." Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly. "What kind?" "Ownership inquiries. Regarding the marital assets." She was quiet for a moment. "Who filed them?" Gerald slid a document across the table. "Someone representing Calvin." Margaret looked at the paper. Not with anger. With interest. "That sounds expensive," she said. Gerald allowed himself a small smile. It could become very expensive. As she left the meeting, something crystallized clearly. Calvin wasn't simply having an affair. He was planning. And planning meant expectations. And expectations built on wrong information always led somewhere painful. She already knew where this was going. She simply allowed it to continue arriving. Now, this is the part of the story I want you to pay close attention to. Because what happened next is something many people misread entirely. People who watched Margaret from the outside during those weeks thought she was doing nothing. They thought the silence meant she had accepted her situation. They thought the stillness meant she had given up. But doing nothing and waiting are not the same thing. And a woman who understands documents, ownership structures, and the patience required to let a situation fully reveal itself, that woman is never doing nothing. She is always doing exactly what is necessary. The divorce conversation happened on a Thursday evening. Margaret was making tea. Calvin stood near the kitchen counter, restless, unable to hold eye contact. "We need to talk," he said. She stirred her tea. "All right. I think we should separate." She nodded once. "All right." The response stunned him. "That's it? You have nothing to say? Would it change your mind?" A pause. "No. Then there isn't much to discuss." He stared at her, then cleared his throat. "We'll need lawyers." "Of course. I've already spoken with Gerald." His pulse quickened. The conversation was moving too smoothly. too efficiently, like something had already been arranged. Margaret, yes. You understand there will be asset discussions. There it was. The real conversation finally arriving. Margaret slowly set down her cup. Then she smiled. A small, quiet smile, the same one from the dinner table. The one that made people feel they were missing something important. What assets? She asked. Calvin blinked. What do you mean, what assets? Our assets. Our assets, she repeated. She looked at him for several seconds. Long enough for the first thread of uncertainty to pull loose. Long enough for the confidence he had been carrying for months to weaken just slightly at the edges. Then she said it.
Calvin, before you start counting money, make sure you know who owns it.
Kitchen went completely silent. Something was wrong. He felt it before he understood it. But before he could form another question, Margaret picked up her tea and walked away, leaving him standing alone with those words echoing in the room behind her. Make sure you know who owns it. He would not stop hearing them for weeks. Calvin sat in a law office 7 days later. His attorney, a competent man named Fletcher, reviewed documents carefully before looking up. Let's talk about expectations, Fletcher said. Calvin straightened. The house. The estate. What are we looking at? Fletcher's expression shifted slightly. That depends on ownership. The word hit Calvin like a cold draft through an open window. It's marital property, Calvin said. Are you certain of that? Calvin opened his mouth, then closed it. Fletcher opened a folder, then a second, then a third. He read in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then he looked up. I wouldn't be so certain, Fletcher said carefully. What does that mean? It means the property was acquired through an inheritance structure. Inherited assets are often treated very differently in divorce proceedings. Very differently. Calvin leaned forward. Wait. Fletcher slid the title paperwork across the desk. Calvin looked at it. Then again. Then a third time. His name was not on it. Not anywhere. Only Margaret's. A cold sensation moved through his chest. There must be a mistake. I don't believe there is. The business, then? Ellison Holdings. Fletcher folded his hands slowly. The company belongs to Margaret. The color drained from Calvin's face. The properties? Margaret. The investment accounts? Also Margaret. He sat back. The picture he had been carrying in his mind for nearly a year, the settlement, the fresh start, the life he was planning with Simone, began falling apart piece by piece. The house, the company, the investments, the properties. Everything he had assumed was shared. Everything Dorothy had assumed was shared. Everything Simone had assumed was shared. None of it was. Not one piece of it. That evening, Calvin drove directly to his mother's house. Dorothy opened the door already smiling, until she saw his face. The house belongs to Margaret, he said. Dorothy laughed. No, it doesn't. It does. She stopped laughing. The business. Silence. The investments. He nodded. Dorothy sat down slowly. The word no left her lips 3 times, quietly, the way people say it when they are trying to rearrange reality using only their voice. Everything belongs to her, Calvin said. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Dorothy stared straight ahead. Then, because denial always finds a door even when the windows are all closed, she said, there must still be money somewhere. Calvin said nothing, and his silence was the only answer she needed. The formal mediation session arrived the following week. Both attorneys, both parties, a mediator named Walsh who had seen every kind of divorce and whose job was to remain unbothered by all of them. Margaret arrived first. She greeted everyone politely, organized her documents, and waited. Calvin arrived expecting uncertainty. What he found instead was his wife, completely at ease, completely prepared, completely calm. The same calm she had carried since the beginning. The same calm everyone had mistaken for weakness. For 30 minutes, documents moved across the table. Property records, ownership structures, business registrations, trust arrangements, investment accounts. Each document said the same thing. The primary assets belonged to Margaret Ellison. Not jointly, not partially, not indirectly, directly, completely, fully. The mediator adjusted his glasses. This appears relatively straightforward, he said. Straightforward. The word sounded almost cruel in that room. Calvin felt heat rising into his face. Because every page confirmed what Margaret had already told him in that kitchen. Every document closed another door. Every line of text dismantled another assumption that had taken months to build. The Ellison estate, Walsh continued, remains in Margaret's name. Gerald nodded. Correct. Ellison Holdings, the commercial portfolio. Correct. The inherited investment accounts. Correct. Every answer felt like another door closing softly but permanently. When the session ended, everyone gathered their papers and prepared to leave. Everyone except Calvin. He sat still. Margaret was almost at the door when he spoke. Why didn't you tell me? She stopped, turned. Tell you what? That everything was yours. She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that doesn't carry anger, only the quiet weight of something true. Then she said it. You never asked. The room had no response to that. Not Gerald. Not Walsh. Not Calvin. Because it was completely, entirely, undeniably true. He had never asked. He had assumed. Dorothy had assumed. Simone had assumed. And entire futures had been built on top of those assumptions like houses constructed on sand, solid looking from a distance, dangerous the moment any real pressure arrived. Margaret continued, her voice even and unhurried. You spent years enjoying the benefits of this life. Calvin looked down. You could have corrected me, he said quietly. I could have, she said. Why didn't you? Her expression softened, not with affection, but with something heavier. Something that took years of patience to carry. Because I thought you married me. The room stayed completely still. Margaret picked up her briefcase, walked to the door, and stepped out, leaving the truth standing in the room behind her. Dorothy's confrontation came 3 days later. She arrived unannounced at the Ellison estate, the same estate she had spent months mentally redecorating for Simone, and demanded to be heard. Margaret received her in the sitting room, calm, composed, exactly as she had been throughout every moment of this entire ordeal. You manipulated everyone, Dorothy said. How? Margaret asked. You hid things. I kept my own ownership records, which were public, filed correctly, available to anyone who looked. Dorothy opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no argument. Property records are not secret. Business filings are not hidden. The information had always existed, in courthouses, on record, accessible to anyone willing to spend 30 minutes looking. Nobody had bothered. They had simply assumed. An assumption, Margaret had always known, is what people do instead of doing their homework. My son spent years in this family, Dorothy said finally. He did, Margaret agreed. He helped build this life. Margaret nodded once. He lived in it. The distinction hung between them like a wall neither woman could move. Dorothy paced, then stopped, then looked at Margaret with something shifting behind her eyes. Not quite anger anymore. Something closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been running very hard in the wrong direction. What about Simone? Dorothy said. She loves Calvin. Margaret considered this for a moment, then asked gently, Are you sure it's Calvin she loves? Or the version of Calvin she was introduced to? Dorothy had no answer. She left without victory, without satisfaction, without even the comfort of righteous anger, because righteous anger requires believing you were the one who was wronged. And somewhere beneath her certainty, Dorothy Hargrove was beginning to understand, slowly, painfully, unavoidably, that she had been the one doing the wronging all along. Simone's conversation with Calvin happened at a quiet cafe not long after. She had learned the truth from documents, not from Dorothy, not from Margaret, from facts, which don't shift depending on who is telling them. She sat across from him. He looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had come for honesty and already knew she wasn't going to enjoy it. Why did you lie? She asked. He said nothing. You told me the marriage was basically over. Silence. You told me you were already discussing separation. More silence. You told me your life was completely different from what it actually was. She waited. Around them, the cafe moved normally. Cups clinked. Conversations continued. Life was entirely unbothered by what was happening at that particular table. It wasn't like that, Calvin finally said. She laughed. Not with humor, but with the specific exhaustion of someone who had hoped for better and deserved it. I cared about you, she said. He looked at the table. You cared about yourself, she said. Both of us paid for it. She stood. She didn't make a scene. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked away and never came back. The divorce finalized quietly, efficiently. Calvin moved into an apartment, modest, ordinary, honest in the way that things are honest when there is nothing left to perform. He was living, for the first time in many years, entirely within his own means. The adjustment was significant. The lifestyle he had grown comfortable with, the status he had worn so naturally, the ease of a life built on someone else's foundation, all of it required returning. And returning things you have borrowed for years is never simple, even when you never formally acknowledge the debt. Dorothy found the adjustment harder. Relatives who had once listened warmly at her gatherings began keeping a careful distance. Not because of the affair, families survive affairs. Not because of the divorce, families survive those too. Because of the celebration. Because Dorothy had spent months celebrating someone else's anticipated loss before she understood what that person actually possessed. People remembered that. People always remember that. There is something that stays with a person when they have watched someone dance on a grave that turned out to be empty. At a family barbecue that summer, Dorothy approached a group of cousins. Conversations paused, just slightly, just enough. And she felt it. She understood, perhaps for the first time, what Margaret must have felt at that dinner table the year before, surrounded by people who had decided the story before it was finished. The realization wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. Most important lessons arrive that way. As for Margaret Ellison, life became quieter, which was exactly what she had wanted. Ellison Holdings expanded. New contracts came in. A regional acquisition exceeded projections. She traveled. She read more. She slept better. Not because she had won something spectacular. Not because karma had delivered justice on a silver tray. But because she had stopped losing something she should never have been losing in the first place, her peace. And peace, once reclaimed, turns out to be worth more than most of what people spend their lives chasing. About a year later, at a business conference in Houston, Margaret found herself at a networking reception when someone touched her elbow gently. She turned. It was Simone. Both women paused. There was a moment where the air between them could have gone in any direction. Then Simone smiled, carefully, honestly, and said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Margaret said. They moved to a quieter corner of the room, and something unexpected happened. They talked, not as enemies, not as rivals, as two women who had survived the same man's choices and come out the other side still standing, still whole, still themselves. "I owe you an apology," Simone said. Margaret shook her head. "You were misled. I still should have asked more questions." "At some point," Margaret said gently, "we all make decisions using the information available to us. What matters is what we do with the truth once it arrives." Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. They parted on good terms. Neither woman carried resentment out of that room. There was no point. The chapter was finished. And finished chapters deserve to stay closed. Years from now, people who were at that Sunday dinner will still talk about it. Not because of the affair. Not because of the divorce. Not even because of the spectacle Dorothy created with such confidence and such certainty. They will talk about Margaret's composure. Because while everyone around her was loud, reactive, and absolutely certain they understood the situation, she was quiet, patient, and right. She never screamed. She never begged. She never tried to convince anyone of her worth. She never competed for a position she already held. She simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own schedule. And when it did, it spoke so clearly that no one in that room needed her to say a single word. There are things I want you to take from this story. The first is something I need you to hear clearly. Your silence is not your weakness. Too many women have been taught that emotion equals strength and composure equals surrender. Margaret understood something different. She understood that the most powerful thing she could do in that dining room, surrounded by people who had already written her ending, was refuse to give them a reaction they could use against her. Emotional control is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is one of the highest forms of intelligence a person can carry into a difficult room. The second lesson is about assumptions. Calvin assumed. Dorothy assumed. Simone assumed. They all built elaborate futures on stories they told themselves. Stories that felt true because nobody had contradicted them yet. But a story, no matter how many people believe it, is not a deed. It is not a business registration. It is not a signature on a legal document. Before you spend money you believe is coming, make sure you understand who it belongs to. Before you celebrate an outcome that hasn't arrived yet, make sure you understand the actual facts of the situation. Assumptions are free to make and extraordinarily expensive to hold. The third lesson is the one I most want to leave with you today. Do not spend your energy trying to prove your value to people who have already decided not to see it. That is a battle no one wins. Not because you aren't valuable. You are. But because the problem was never your value. It was their vision. Margaret didn't need Dorothy to recognize her worth. She didn't need Calvin's family to change their minds about her. She didn't need to be vindicated at that dinner table with everyone watching. The truth vindicated her. On its own time. In its own way. Without her having to raise her voice once. And that is the only vindication that actually lasts. A healthy relationship, a real one, cannot survive on convenience, assumption, or what one person imagines they are entitled to. It survives on honesty, on genuine partnership, on two people who choose each other clearly and continue choosing each other openly. When respect leaves a relationship, the relationship has already ended. The paperwork just hasn't caught up yet. Margaret Ellison did not win because she was wealthy. She did not win because she had better lawyers or smarter documentation or a more impressive portfolio. She won because when the moment came to shrink, she refused. She won because she knew her worth before anyone else in that room did. And she was patient enough, steady enough, to let the truth do the rest. Money can be gained and lost. Property can change hands. Companies grow and shrink and transform. But the kind of dignity Margaret carried into every room of that story, composed, certain, unhurried, that cannot be taken from a person. That is built quietly, over years, by women who have decided, somewhere deep and unshakable inside themselves, that they will not be reduced. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it with them. And if this is the first time you've found our channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Because there are more stories like this one. And every single one of them has something to teach.